All right, author, historian Joe Lambert, how are you doing?
Doing well.
Good. Welcome to the studio. So, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about you, where you came from, a little bit of your origin story?
Okay, thanks for having me.
Sure.
Well, I'm a native of Girard. I grew up there, went to high school there, went to college at Youngstown State University. That's where I got my degrees in history. I hold a bachelor's degree and master's degree. And at that time, I took a job at the Youngstown Steel Museum and was there when it first opened 30 years ago. They just celebrated the 30th anniversary last year and worked there for a couple of years. And unfortunately, they had a round of layoffs. So some of us lost our jobs there. However, just love local history. I have a passion for it. I love learning about it. And I can't get enough of it. You know, even though my career took me outside of history, I'm actually in healthcare, and I've been a healthcare administrator for 30 years. I still fall back on history as kind of my hobby, you know, my I'll say relief, but just a way to relax and kind of go back in time and read interesting stories, and particularly about the Mahoning Valley. So.
Yeah, and you can't get a better place to live if you're addicted to history. I mean, outside of Philadelphia, there's so many things happen here. So many industries were birthed just in this area. So where did you get sort of your love for the genre, the historical genre?
Well, I'll tell you, growing up, you know, I remember many summer evenings sitting on the front porch, and my father would tell us stories of his childhood growing up during the Depression in Girard. And I was fascinated by those stories. And I would try to imagine what it was like growing up during those rough times. And, I guess, you know, that just cultivated things for me going on. And, you know, I always had a love for Lincoln and the Civil War. And the older I got, you know, the more appreciation I had for local industry as well. I mean, growing up here in the Mahoning Valley, you couldn't escape
Right.
the mills and the smoky skies and that sort of thing. Now, my mother worked at St. Elizabeth Hospital, and my father, they would work opposite shifts, so my dad would have to go pick her up at 11 o'clock at night sometimes. And we would drive down 422, passing the Briar Hill Works on our way to St. Elizabeth Hospital, and just remembering how intimidating I think those scenes were for a young child. Yeah.
Any characters from the Mahoning Valley the standouts that are your favorite?
Well, certainly Joe Butler comes to mind,
Okay.
of course, and all of his associates. You know, James Campbell, David Todd, of course, kind of predates those guys by about 20, 30 years in the industry, if not a little bit longer. But those guys kind of really made their mark
Tell
here.
us a little bit about the story. What got you drawn into those characters?
Well, I'll tell you, when I was working at the Steel Museum, it was only 2 years, but it was in its formative years. I mean, we weren't even open when I got my job there, but you know, we were very active in collecting. And around that time, you're talking the early 90s, most of the mills were done. And they were vacant. And as an assistant, you know, we got to travel around the Mahoning Valley collecting artifacts from the empty mills and kind of roaming the grounds. We had permission, of course, to go on and kind of collect artifacts. And so that was a unique experience for me. In addition, you know, the museum has an archives. And the information that was coming in was being donated by former steelworkers or libraries. You know, Joe Butler was one of those characters, just always stood out. And, you know, again, growing up in the Mahoning Valley, you kind of knew of the Butler, certainly visited as a kid, but never knew who was behind it. And so you pick up a book and you start looking at this information about Joe Butler or newspaper articles or journals, because he was a prolific writer. He would submit articles to Iron Age and Iron Industry were the other trade magazine, and he was just an authoritarian on the industry as he was helping to shape it. He was a local product. Butler was. He wasn't born in Niles. He was born in Mercer County in 1840 and moved to Niles with his family, and grew up with William McKinley, a childhood friend of his.
It's cool.
Isn't
So
it?
cool.
Yeah. And got a job in his early teens working at the James Ward Company. Now, his father worked there as well and ran the company store. And Joe Butler, like I said, as a young teenager, got his first start in the business. And really, to his credit, worked very hard in the industry. Was a very smart young man. Went to a business school in Pittsburgh, and just had right connections. People liked what they saw out of him, and he kind of worked his way up in the industry and became a manager, and then eventually part owner of some of the enterprises in the Mahoning Valley.
So what about this area drew that industry to this area?
Well, that's a great question, because looking back on it today, it really didn't have the major waterway in which to transport products like Pittsburgh. Of course, Pittsburgh has the three rivers, and the rivers were large enough to sustain traffic, barge traffic. The Mahoning Valley, on the other hand, certainly had the raw resources. They had iron ore, they had the coal, and they had some water in which to power their mills. The Mahoning River powered a lot of their mills. What really helped the industry along, though, was the canal that came through, the P&O Canal that came through in about 1838, which connected Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley to Akron. And then from Akron, the P&O Canal ran east-west, and it hooked up with the Ohio Canal, which ran north-south in Akron. And it connected essentially the Mahoning Valley to the Lake Erie traffic, and certainly down to the Ohio River. And it tied us into Pittsburgh as well. So we were able to ship our products to Cleveland or Pittsburgh, and then from there and beyond.
Yeah, sometimes when I see some of this infrastructure of old, where Yellow Duck Creek, where they piped in all of this water down to the mills, just how much money they were willing to spend in support of this industry. I don't necessarily think you could even do that, today. Something like that.
No. And you mentioned Yellow Duck Park too. That was the site of the first iron furnace, I should say, in Ohio. That was 1803. That was the Hopewell furnace, which is there's still remnants of it. If you hike back in the woods, you could find it back there.
Yeah, we walked that whole river, and when you just see that piping in there, they did not do things on the cheap. They scaped the whole land in order to get water pumped in down there. It was just amazing.
Right, and of course, they emptied into the river as well, which caused a lifetime of pollution to the river.
Yeah, and so more on a national level, the Carnegies, the Fricks, that whole group too. There was a lot of influence that they had on our area as well.
Right, because eventually, I mean, there was certainly a worth in the Mahoning Valley. So Frick, for example, Butler brags about making his first large-scale contract with Frick for coal. Frick would earn the title of Coal King, and Butler probably helped him along in that path. And his wealth was accumulated afterwards, along with Carnegie, and those guys were obviously Pittsburgh Titans, but they certainly had interest in the Mahoning Valley. Carnegie had a mill, the Carnegie Mill here in Youngstown, and he earned a great deal of money. And Butler was a contemporary of those guys, and he certainly was a businessman, savvy enough to understand that he needed to exist with these guys. A lot of those guys wanted to come in and kind of take over the Mahoning Valley, but Butler and James Campbell, for example, rallied the locals, the Wicks, for sure, to kind of keep those outsiders at bay, because they really weren't trusting what those guys would do once they came into the Mahoning Valley.
Yeah, in stories, you always got a sense for the Carnegies, and that group was very shrewd, rolled over people pretty easily, and you never get that history, those stories with the local guys. It seems like they were the bar was a little higher with them.
I agree with you on that, and that matter of fact, that's one thing that attracted me to Butler, in particular. Certainly Frick and Carnegie, they gave their money away. I kind of made the argument that they kind of gave their money away afterwards when they knew they had some repentance to do. But
Right.
Butler was one of those guys who, as he was coming up in the industry, he was very involved in his community. Here's a guy in the 1860s who was a member of Youngstown's first city council. He was president of the Youngstown Chamber of Commerce for a number of years. When he traveled overseas, when he went to Europe, he loved his history. He loved his artwork, of course, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But in terms of history, he visited George Washington's ancestors' birth home estate, and really got the ball moving. It was a long process to get that property protected and under the influence of American funding, to kind of protect that site. So he loved American history. He was one of the first to incorporate the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. He was a prolific writer. He loved to record Youngstown history. He wrote 8 books in his lifetime. He loved his connection with William McKinley, of course. Certainly supported McKinley during his rise in politics, whether it was in Congress or the governorship, and then eventually to the presidency itself. After McKinley was assassinated, Butler served as an honorary pallbearer for his childhood friend. But during his term, Butler had great access to McKinley. Of course, he was living in Canton at the time, and Butler had almost free passage to go visit McKinley anytime he was in Canton. And certainly in Washington, he would visit the president at the White House as well.
And those 3 people you mentioned, they did a lot of philanthropy themselves, even without a blemish record. So were they just very charitable to the area? They were connected to the area, or were they also making up for some blemishes?
Well, I think they were making up for some blemishes.
Yeah?
As a matter of fact, Carnegie wasn't so quick to donate money to local projects, and Butler had to remind him that he earned a great deal of his wealth here in Youngstown. One example in particular was the Youngstown Public Library, the Reuben McMillan Library, who was a former superintendent of schools in Youngstown. And as a matter of fact, when Butler first got married and moved to Youngstown with his wife Harriet, he stayed with McMillan for about a year and a half or so until they were on their feet and could afford their own home. But anyways, that library project was well underway, and the fundraising effort came up about $50,000 short, and so the idea was to tap Carnegie, and Butler was the man to kind of reach out to Carnegie, who declined the request at first. Primarily, we're told, because the building would not be named after him. Now, back then, Carnegie was trying to get rid of his wealth and was building libraries all over the country as long as they were named after him. And again, Butler had to remind Carnegie that, look, you made a lot of money in the Mahoning Valley. It's the least you can do. And sure enough, Carnegie eventually donated the final $50,000. Matter of fact, if you're in the library in the lobby, the newly renovated library, you'll see in the lobby that it is a designated Carnegie library.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I want you to end a debate, or help me with the debate here.
Yeah.
So we toured a Carnegie Museum and a Frick Museum, and listening to the tour guide tell the story, each one framed the other as the villain and the bad guy. So
strike, yeah.
what is your outlook? Who was the bad guy here?
I think Carnegie set Frick up because
Okay.
he knew labor negotiations were up, and Carnegie went overseas to Scotland and stayed there and left Frick behind to manage
The fall guy.
The fall guy. Yeah. So he what a mess. Yeah, he had to deal with. But yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
those
but he
who are unfamiliar with the story, at the time there was, bitter labor disputes, and Frick was number 2 guy for Carnegie,
right.
and he managed sort of the labor aspect of the enterprise. And yeah, when things got heated, Carnegie was nowhere to be found.
Nowhere to be found. Yep.
Nowhere to
that
be.
was the Homestead strike we're talking about.
Yes, yeah, and it was a bloody. Lots of people lost their lives
Right.
during it. It's a very historic moment in
Right.
labor for sure.
Right.
All right, so tell us a little bit about your book, and tell us, because you have multiple. You got more than
I
one.
have 2 books.
So, tell us about it.
The first came out In 2022, I co-authored it with the late Rick Shale. And again, it was a book that really I thought about doing back in my days at the Steel Museum. I'm a young guy back in the 20-some years old. I'm thinking, boy, I'm going to write a book someday. And it was my goal. Took a long time, but I certainly needed the expertise and guidance of someone as experienced as a Professor Rick Shale. So he was a published author when I reached out to him, and he loved the local history as well. And we kind of teamed up on the Butler project to get it across the finish line.
And did you just like dig into the research? Like, how long did it take you to assemble?
Yeah, I did. And Rick would always say, "Well, you're the historian," So he would certainly defer to me, and he was the
Microfiche and digging into
for
the
sure,
books.
yeah. Microfilm, microfiche. Matter of fact, I'm going to go back to the Steel Museum. They had hard copies of magazines as well, so there was a lot of research material down there as well. And certainly kind of wrote the story, wrote the drafts, and Rick said, "Well, you have a lot of good stuff here, but let's get it in the right order." It's kind of hard for me, but Joe Butler was a very busy man. And it was hard to kind of keep track of all the projects that he was working on simultaneously. I mean, I can't imagine what it was like for him to be living, during the course of these projects and trying to manage all these things, let alone for someone like me to try to go back and make sense out of it. And Rick really helped to get that book in its proper order.
Now, do we still have ancestors of those three families living around here?
Yeah.
The Wicks, the Todds?
Oh, for sure. Well, I could tell you for sure there's Butler descendants that I've come across in the research and have been very supportive. Matter of fact, I met a number of them in the last couple of years at the Butler Art Show. I'd set up there at Christmas time. They have an annual show for crafts to be sold, and I would set up there with my book for sale and met a number of his descendants that way.
And what's his connection with the art world?
Joe Butler just had a passion for art. Going back to, I'll tell you, when he was 25 years old, he was recruited from a firm in Chicago who found him in Niles working for James Ward. And they recruited Joe Butler to go out to Chicago, and he went out there for about a year or two. And at that time, he had his first portrait painted of him. I think the artist's name was Cogswell. And I think he paid $100 for it. And but Joe Butler just had a passion for art. And on his travels, and I had mentioned earlier, when he would go to Europe, he would visit all the art museums in Europe. And one thing that stuck out in his mind was, although he loved the artistry of European artists, he noticed that American artists were not given their fair share in those museums. And I'll tell you this too: as he was building his museum, the Butler Art Institute, there's a misconception that, Joe Butler used to keep his art collection on display on the third floor gallery of his home on Wick Avenue. And his home stood where the McDonough Museum stands. And the misconception is that there was a house fire, and a number of his paintings were destroyed. And so, again, there was misbelief that because of that fire, he decided to build a museum and dedicate it to American art. Okay, well, that's not true. The fact is, the museum was already under construction when the house fire occurred. Now, to clarify what he did is, at that point, he decided, okay, I'm going to dedicate this museum to American art. Okay, so the museum was already under construction, but the idea that he grabbed and ran with is that, okay, I'm going to dedicate this museum to American art and American artists.
Okay. And so we have, and those of you who are watching and listening, we have a ton of museums that sort of give you an insight into that era. We have a home, the Arms Museum up there, where you have the layout as it was in that era, and there's a lot of thick history that you could learn about it. What do you think are, if you wanted to get really deep into Youngstown history, where's the best places to check out?
Well, the first place to start is the Tyler Center, the home of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, for sure. They have wonderful displays that are ever changing. They have a wonderful archives, which, you can't write local history without the valuable collections that they have. I mean, there's a number of local historical societies in the Mahoning Valley that do the same, preserve that local history. Struthers, Camel, Girard, Niles, even going across the board to the Sharon Historical Society. All kinds of great information. And I guess that's one thing, too, that I have been mentioning, and I've been giving presentations on my books over the last 2 years. And the one thing that I want folks to understand is that although our industrial history, in the end, is a sad one. It's a sad ending, but there's so much rich history to be discovered in there. I mean, our home, our valley was a rich and thriving and important location at one time, and there's many things to be discovered in there that we should be proud of. Certainly, some of the things that I write about. No one's perfect. Everybody has their flaws, and so does Joe Butler, so does David Todd, and the other folks that we mentioned. But there's so much rich history in there that we need to be and remember.
Yeah, and it kind of ruins some of your heroes through that age, because all of them did have those blemishes. And when you get down and look at the Edisons, look at the Teslas, they were all flawed in certain way. Great stories to tell, and great genius behind in their minds. But they were all flawed humans, just like the rest of us.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, you mentioned Camel. When you drive over that way and you see sort of the ruins of the city of like apartment structures or housing, what do you know about that? I've heard stories about that they were little cities that the mills had produced. What do you know about those?
Well, I'm not sure if you're referring to the prefabbed homes, prefab concrete. There was the first structures in America that were built out of prefabricated concrete. So those homes were made in Camel for the workers of the mills. And they're still standing, but I know that they've kind of been areas of concern, I guess.
Yeah, well, one of the stories I heard is that the workers were paid in a currency for the marketplace of the shop or something like that.
Yeah, company stores. They were paid in company script. Matter of fact, that goes back a long ways. Matter of fact, when Joe Butler was growing up in Niles in the 1840s and 50s, the James Ward Company paid their workers in company script. And it was one way for management to kind of keep their control of the workers.
Buy your groceries,
all there,
yeah,
all your necessities. They paid you in script, not in American currency, if you will.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So why don't you tell everybody what your books are and where to get them and support your cause?
Thank you. Well, the first book on Butler is called First Citizen, The Industrious Life of Joseph G. Butler Jr. And the second book is about David Todd, who was governor of Ohio during the Civil War. And the name of that book is The Political Transformation of David Todd, Governing Ohio During the Height of the Civil War. They're both for sale. I mean, you go online, you just Google it, it'll pop up somewhere, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. Locally, they're both for sale at the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. The Butler Institute is also carrying them in their gift shop. And I can't think of where else, but it's out there.
All right.
Yeah.
Author Joe Lambert, thank you so much for coming down and talking with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.